What do you think is the most useful grammatical construction that you can use in your Cambridge English exam? Or probably any English exam, come to think of it. And when I say useful, I mean the grammatical construction that can be used in the most contexts, or literally the most parts of the exam, and also impress the examiners and get those extra marks. If you want to pause the video for a few seconds to have a think about it, then do so. Because maybe you think it's the conditionals, right? I mean, if you get the conditionals right and use them in the right context and form them in the right way with the right grammar, they can really get you some good marks. Or maybe verb tenses. Yes, of course you need to use a wide range of verb tenses in your writing compositions and in your speaking, again in the right context. But that's kind of a given. That's something you should be doing, especially at the high levels anyway. And things like reported speech, relative clauses, cleft sentences, all of these things I've spoken about in other videos and in my grammar course. They're all very important, of course. But for me, there's one that is the most useful, that beats all the rest. And I have some good news, because it's not that difficult to form this grammatical construction. So in my opinion, and it is just my opinion, but it's my opinion based on over 20 years of helping thousands of people prepare for the Cambridge English exams, in my opinion, it's the passive voice. Now, why do I say the passive voice? Well, what I said before, you can use the passive voice in your writings. In fact, you should use the passive voice in more formal writings. You can use it in your speaking, because it can be used in more informal, colloquial contexts. And it comes up almost always. I'm not going to say always, because it may not come up in your particular exam, but in my experience, we almost always see some form of the passive voice in the reading and use of English, especially in part 4 of the use of English, which is the keyword transformation. So let's just spend a couple of minutes looking at how and when it might come up in your Cambridge English exam. So first of all, in the reading and use of English part 4, the keyword transformation, I have an example from a C1 advanced sample test. So if you're not familiar with this part, I'll share a link to a video where I go into detail on how to do this part, my tips on the best strategy. But basically you have a lead-in sentence, a complete sentence, a keyword, in this case it's alleged, and then you have to rewrite the sentence, filling in the gap, using the keyword without changing it, making sure that the second sentence is as similar as possible as the first sentence. So as I said, we're looking at the passive voice here. So this is not a big test. I've told you what grammar we're looking for. The lead-in sentence is, they say a visitor to the National Gallery damaged an 18th century painting. The keyword is alleged, and then the follow-up sentence is a visitor to the National Gallery, an 18th century painting. So in this case, it is alleged to have damaged. So this is the passive voice. And it comes up very, very often in this part of the exam. As I said, I'm not going to say it will definitely appear in your exam, but it's highly likely, and it's worth studying, not only for this part of the exam, but for other parts. But let's have a look at a C2 proficiency example now. So this one, the driver instructed passengers to move down the bus. The key word is way, and then we have passengers down the bus by the driver. So you can see immediately, you should have identified that this requires the passive voice, because the driver, which is the subject in the first sentence, has become the object of the second sentence, and passengers has become the subject of the follow-up sentence. So that gives you a huge clue that you need the passive voice. Curiously, the grammar in this C2 proficiency example is actually a lot more basic than the C1 example we've just looked at. What is more difficult here is the vocabulary, because they're looking for a particular fixed phrase, a fixed expression. And it is passengers were instructed to or told to make their way down the bus by the driver. So were instructed to, that's the passive form, or told to, both, or either option would be accepted there. And then make their way is the fixed expression. So in that second example, as I said, although it's C2 proficiency, the grammar was relatively basic, but you need to be able to identify the passive voice when it's needed in these tasks. So studying the passive voice before your exam will be extremely useful. But also for the writing part, because as I said, with a more formal writing task, like the essay, the report, proposal, even a formal letter, you're going to need to use the passive voice. It's really necessary. Because you don't want to be too personal. You want to keep it impersonal. I'm going to give you some examples now of how and why we use the passive voice in essays in particular. So this is an example essay from the C2 proficiency. It's a real student sample essay. And I chose this example because, as you can see, this student did particularly well. They got maximum scores in each of the criteria, so it's a really good example. That doesn't mean it's perfect. People often think that if a student gets 5 out of 5, the maximum marks in the C2 proficiency, then it must be perfect. Their writing composition must be perfect. That's not the case. They may make mistakes, but the fact is the essay is good enough to get maximum scores. So what we're focusing on here really is the communicative achievement and the language, because using the passive voice appropriately in an essay demonstrates that the candidate understands what register is necessary. So in the essay you need a neutral to formal register. That's the most appropriate. But of course the language criterion is also relevant here because it's the grammar. We're looking at grammar, and if you can use the passive voice correctly, you'll get more marks for that. So let's look at how this candidate used the passive voice in just one paragraph. They used the passive voice twice. This is just a quick example. However, it should be noted that the things that irritate people will vary. So it should be noted. That's a really appropriate use of grammar and the passive voice here. Another candidate may have written people should note or you must note, but it should be noted makes it less personal and more general. As you can see further down in that paragraph, this is really a really nice use of the passive voice, really sophisticated and advanced. This candidate wrote, "It was once considered." Another candidate may have written, "People used to consider." And grammatically that's fine, there's nothing wrong with that. But this is just more appropriate using the passive voice. Let's move on to a C1 example now. So this is another essay. Again, got some pretty good scores, 5, 4, 4, and 4. Again, we're focusing on the communicative achievement and language here. So not maximum scores, but still very good scores. And this candidate also used the passive voice. First of all, it has to be said. Another candidate may have written, "I have to say," or we have to say. But no, it has to be said is more appropriate. And then later, again, even better for me, an even better use of the passive voice here, rules can be placed differently. So in this case, actually, the candidate has used the wrong vocabulary because we don't use placed with rules. We wouldn't say to place rules or rules can be placed. We would say set or imposed or implemented, something like that. But what we're focusing on here is the grammar. And again, this candidate has used the passive voice correctly and in the right context. Again, another candidate may have written, "Parents can place rules," or "Teachers can place rules," or even just "people can place rules." But rules can be placed is more appropriate because we don't really need to refer to who, the doers of the action, the actors who perform this action. That's not really important here, or it's quite obvious from the context. So rules can be set, or rules can be imposed, or rules can be implemented. Let's look at a slightly worse example. So this is an example of a student who hasn't used the passive voice and perhaps should have done. This example is from the B2 first exam, so this is a bad example. Now, I don't want you to think that the other candidates got high scores just because they used the passive voice. That's not the case. Or that this candidate got low scores because they didn't use the passive voice. Now, there are a lot more things to take into consideration, but using the passive voice in this text may have got them a higher score. So let's look at a couple of examples. So this candidate wrote, "I think that my country has problems with pollution to the environment like all other countries." So as I said earlier, you don't want to be too personal in an essay. You should just present your ideas in a more impersonal, academic way. So I recommend here, "It is thought that this country, like many others, has problems with pollution." So it is thought instead of I think, and then this country rather than my country, because this essay may be read in another country, and that this student's country hasn't been mentioned in this essay before. So my country, again, is a bit too personal. In fact, I think I would choose the verb believe here rather than think. It expresses the same idea, but in a slightly more formal way. Another example, a very short sentence from the same example essay. "I don't know, what should we do?" Okay, there's a problem with the word order there, of course, but again, what we're focusing on is the passive voice. So how would you rewrite that sentence using the passive voice? Well, this is one option. It is not known. So not I don't know. That's far too personal for an essay. So it is not known. And then what should be done. So we have two examples here. Not what we should do, but what should be done in general. It is not known what should be done. So that's a much better sentence. It's much less personal, much more impersonal. But again, I think there's an even better option. So the correct course of action is not clear. Now that's very advanced, very sophisticated, but I didn't want to move on without giving you the best option for that sentence. Okay, so you really should be using the passive voice in your formal writing compositions. It's not just that it's going to get you more marks. It's appropriate. It's the right structure to use, and that in the end is what the examiners are really looking for. You may try to use a more advanced grammatical structure, but if it's not appropriate, then you're not going to get more marks. In fact, you could be penalized for not expressing your ideas in an effective way. But even in the speaking part of the exam, it's quite likely, highly likely I would say, that you'll need to use the passive voice at some time. So let's look at some examples which you can use in your speaking. The first example, I was born and bred in Madrid. I was born. It's probably, I would say, the most common use of the passive voice in English, because that's just the fixed expression. I was born. It's a passive action. And born and bred is a nice advanced way to express that you were not only born, but you grew up in Madrid too. And then if you want to speak about some aspects of your hometown, you say my hometown is known for something. In this case, I've put its architecture. So is known is the passive voice. And the next one, I've been told the earth is flat. So in this case, perhaps you don't want to say who told you. Maybe you're a bit embarrassed to say that your friend Dave told you. You could say Dave told me the earth is flat, but it's not really important who told you, especially the examiner or your partner doesn't know who Dave is anyway. So just say, I've been told the earth is flat. And it said AI will take over the world. So it said, again, in general, we're not referring to who said it. It's not so important. So it said AI will take over the world. And finally, maybe when you're talking about the photographs, the photograph part of your exam, the photo looks like it was taken at night. Now, in my online grammar course, I go into a lot of detail about how to form the passive voice, sort of quite sophisticated structures of the passive voice, and lots of examples. But before I finish this video, I did just want to have a look at why we use the passive voice first and how to form a passive voice sentence. So why use the passive voice? Well, first of all, for a formal register, as I said, for the formal writing compositions, but also in formal speeches. So this example, it is believed that increased investment is needed. Yeah, don't say, I believe that increased investment is needed. It's too personal. We're not really interested in your personal opinion. It's just a general observation. To emphasize the action. When we want to focus on the action rather than the person or people who performed the action, so the actors. In this case, alien life has been discovered on Pluto. That's important, right? That's really the important part of this sentence. Alien life has been discovered. Wow. By scientists? Okay, yeah, that's relatively important. Or maybe the actor, or the person who performed the action, the doer of the action, is unknown or not important. So the cathedral was built in the 15th century. I don't know who built the cathedral, or maybe it was John. I don't know. It's not really important. It's the fact that the cathedral was built in the 15th century that is important. And finally, when we just want to be less direct or less accusatory. So maybe something bad has happened, maybe somebody has done something wrong, but we don't really want to accuse that person directly. So we could just say, for example, the project wasn't finished on time. Maybe it was Mary who didn't finish the project on time. Or maybe it was the department or the team that didn't finish the project on time, but we don't want to be too direct or accusatory. So how to form the passive voice now? Well, let's look at this sentence. This is just the active voice. Experts believe the earth is spherical. So here we have the SVO, subject, verb, object. Experts is the subject of this sentence, believe is the verb, and the earth is the object. But for the passive voice, the object becomes the subject. So we move the earth to the start of the sentence. Then we have the verb, and then the subject becomes optional. So maybe you want to say by experts, or maybe you think it's not necessary. But the important thing to remember that in a passive voice construction, you always need the verb to be in the correct tense, and then the main verb in the past participle form. So you probably knew that last part, right? How to construct a passive voice sentence. but it's always good revision. And as I said, you need to be studying all the grammar before your Cambridge English exam. You need to revise everything, or maybe you need to study new grammatical structures that you haven't studied before. But for me, the passive voice is the most useful construction. Okay, let me know what you think, if you agree with me or not, in the comments, and I'll see you very soon for another video.